All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Max Skelton, the director of the Institute of Regional and International Studies, which is based at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. Since our last webinar on the electricity sector, some of you have reached out regarding the video recordings. And just so that you know, you can access the full recordings of all of these sessions through the IRIS website or through the AUIS YouTube channel. Today, we're addressing the budget crisis between Erbil and Baghdad, with a particular focus on the political and economic implications for the Kurdish region. First, we will begin with an opening question for each of the panelists. And then secondly, we will have the panelists engage one another with some questions of their own. And then finally, we'll open up the floor to your questions, which can be submitted by way of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now for the speakers. First, we have with us today His Excellency Hemen Haurami, who is a member of the KDP Leadership Council and the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament in the Kurdistan Regional Government. And thank you, Kak Hemen, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Secondly, we are joined by Maria Fantapi, who serves as the Special Advisor for the MENA region at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Thirdly, we have Hiwa Osman, a widely known political analyst focusing on Iraqi affairs. And finally, once again, we're joined by Ahmed Dabakhshali, who's a senior fellow at IRIS. Thank you all for joining us. Kak Hemen, I'd like to begin with you.
Yes.
Could you give us a sense of the current status of the negotiations with Baghdad and what the Kurdish position is? And, you know, in addition to that, we all know that whatever agreement is reached, the KRG is going to struggle to meet its budgetary requirements and will have to probably cut salaries and resort to other measures. What's the plan for dealing with a dramatically constrained budget in the Kurdistan region?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to invite me for this fabulous moment with my dear friends, with Kakiwa, with Dr. Ahmed, with Anne Maria, and all those who are listening to us. Just a few weeks ago, we in the Kurdistan Parliament, we had a very important meeting with the Kurdistan Regional Government delegation who went to Baghdad many times to negotiate with the government, with the previous government, with Adil Abdul Mahdi's government, and also with the relevant ministries. And they briefed us, all the cross-party, all the blocks in the Kurdistan region. And they stressed on so many important issues that I would like to echo what we heard from them. That's the first, the strategy of dialogue, continuing dialogue to find a sustainable solution for the pending issues between Kurdistan region and Baghdad. There is no alternative for this dialogue. And we in the Kurdistan Parliament support that course of action for having dialogue and talks with Baghdad to solve the pending issues that we have. And also, we have been following up with them on the situation, and the most up-to-date things that they have told us that they have continued with the relevant officials from the Ministry of Finance, from the Prime Minister's office, and also they have met with then the Prime Minister designate Kaldani, and now also as the Prime Minister. There is a plan for after the holidays of the feast that the KRG's delegation, the technical delegation, and the ministerial delegation to go back to Baghdad to iron out all the necessary agreements that is needed. And as a good gestures, we have heard from the Council of Ministers that the Prime Minister decided to send 400 billion Iraqi dinar as part of the April's requirements, financial support for Kurdistan as part of the budget. Up to this moment that I'm talking to you, the Ministry of Finance in Baghdad, they have not yet released that 400 billion Iraqi dinars. So we are waiting for that. Definitely the strategy in the Kurdistan Regional Government, in the Parliament, and also in the Kurdistan Presidency, because we held bilateral meeting, the three presidencies meeting, is to continue this dialogue with Baghdad. We are forward looking for the issues-based relationship with Baghdad because there are common threats to all of us in Iraq and Kurdistan region. The resurgence of ISIS is not a threat only to the Iraqi government, it's to all of us. Dealing with the fallout of the oil price, also it's an issue that we have to deal with it jointly. Also the economic fallout of the COVID-19 situation and the lockdown in Iraq. So these are three main issues that we in the Kurdistan Parliament also encouraging the KRG to reach a deal with Baghdad. Absolutely, even with the solutions for that, what's called the Qanuni Dar al-Maliya, the financial management law, what we are going to receive from Baghdad and from generating from the non-revenue domestic revenues that we have, it's not going to be enough to continue as we have been doing in the past months. For example, just to give you a sense, of the revenues and the incomes in Kurdistan in January and in April, and based on that for the future months that we are going to have. In January, the Kurdistan region revenues for January, we received $295 million from the oil revenues net to the Ministry of Finance in Kurdistan region. We had $383 million from the Iraqi government as the support. We had about $245 million revenues from the non-oil revenues that we had in that area, 17 million from the Pentagon as a support for the stipends for the Peshmerga. So all in all, we had about $939 million revenues for Kurdistan region in January. But in April, unfortunately, there was zero support from Baghdad because that $383 million were stopped. And from the domestic revenues, we had only from 245 in January, due to the lockdown of the COVID-19, it became only $45 million. And the net income revenues from the oil for April for Kurdistan region was almost about 60 million. So definitely with the domestic revenues, with the oil price, what we receive from Baghdad, it's not going to be 939 million for the coming months. And so that's why we in Kurdistan, we have been following the party to implement the reform law that was passed in Parliament. Members of Parliament voted for reassessment and also to launch the security management in the disputed territories, because there are many gaps in that area. ISIS is acting right now very actively in those areas in terms of the quality of the attacks and in terms of the quantity of the attacks. It's very alarming, both for Kurdistan region, for the Iraqi government, and for the regional security and the international security. So based on this, we are encouraging our KRG and following up to continue this dialogue. And as you know, the Kurdistan leadership, the presidency, we in parliament and in government, we have supported Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kazemi, and we're going to support him very strongly in order, because the political stability in Baghdad is very important for Kurdistan. To having a functioning government in Baghdad is very important for Kurdistan. And from our side, from Kurdistan region, the path, the strategy is that to support this government and to find common grounds. And also we expect, because we are not going to receive the same as in the previous months, for example, because the revenue for Baghdad has fallen as well. Based on the new realities and the new facts and the political stability for the Iraqi government, for having a good partner in order to find sustainable solution based on constitution, we in the Kurdistan region also are going to support Prime Minister Kazemi and to give that political support that he needs, and also to reach consensus on finding solution for the remaining issues that we have. And I will be very glad later to answer any questions. So that will be my opening remarks.
Thank you, Kakemen. Kakiwa, you followed how the Kurdish factions have engaged counterparts in Baghdad, not only during these negotiations, but also in previous ones. Help us understand how we got to this point, how the distrust between the two sides is developed, and how not only the lack of communication and distrust between Erbil and Baghdad, but also among and between the Kurdish factions. Does any side have a long-term strategy, or is it more of an ad hoc approach to each negotiation?
That's a $1 million question. I should charge you for that. Thank you very much for this invitation. Great honor to share the platform with the distinguished speakers. I've been following Erbil-Baghdad pretty much since 2003, both as a journalist and as an advisor to President Talabani, and later as a commentator and writer. Right from the start, I think we had 4 issues that were the hanging issues. They were put in the initial document that was called the Transitional Administrative Law of 2004. Then we moved to the constitution, the flaws that were in the transitional administrative law, which was basically everybody's wish list, put together into one seemingly coherent document. They moved to the constitution, Article 140, other articles to do with the powers of the region and with the budget, the articles to do with the hydrocarbon management of the resource, the management of energy resources in the Kurdistan region and in Iraq. So a lot of these, many of the outstanding issues that have been called the 4 the four issues that were between Erbil and Baghdad are still standing pretty much up until today. Various delegations, various rounds of negotiations, various prime ministers changed. But today, when we look at the situation, it is pretty much in the eyes of the public is reduced to two things. In the eyes of the Kurdish public, it is reduced to the issue of salaries. Salary came, salary didn't come, and this is the main driving force for negotiations, and this is what makes the news these days. On the other side, it has the way the negotiations over the past 16 or 17 years have been conducted did not inform the public in such a way that the people feel some kind of ownership of it. And as a result, we hear politicians, for example, from Baghdad, blaming everything on Kurdistan. A guy from Basra says the reason we are in this misery is because Kurdistan is taking all the oil or all the revenues of the resources of the country. And the same situation with some of their other MPs. If they want to make a popular statement, they all speak against the Kurdish region and how it is much more advanced than that. I think big part of this goes back to the fact that talks between Erbil and Baghdad have always remained within the two delegations. There wasn't a serious engagement, public engagement in these talks. And the differences over the years, I think leaderships on both sides saw that prefer to hide the differences from the public rather than making them public so that people, they can get some kind of public opinion for their positions. A typical Erbil-Baghdad, basically, cycle of talks of a conflict. Either our oil minister here, I mean, the issues are still standing. We are not in agreement still over, we don't have an agreement over energy management, over the hydrocarbon law, which is supposed to be passed. There is no real final agreement over the status of the Peshmerga forces. Article 140 remains to be seen, whether it is how much of Article 140 about the disputed territories is still to be, has been implemented, and when will the day come when we say Article 140 is implemented. The fourth issue is the federal powers and the budgetary issue, the budgetary differences between Erbil points of view. I think we are now at a point, the atmosphere, the political atmosphere is ripe for a new approach. The old approach, we have tried this old approach with 4, 5 different prime ministers of the country, and we keep getting the same results. You know, we don't solve the issues. Sending salaries for 1 month is not a permanent solution. That's why it has the relationship between Erbil and Baghdad is reduced to an ad hoc steps and at times where the issues are political, it's handled by technicals, and at times where the issues are technical, politicians dabble with it. And this is where it has created a big, I believe, misunderstanding at the public level between Erbil and Baghdad, even within Kurdistan. Some parties say that the KRG has taken all of this money and they're not distributing it in a good way. There should have been a lot more transparency as to the talks, the facts, and the figures and numbers that are to do with talks with the process of settling those 4 issues. Today we have a new prime minister in Baghdad. We also have a new prime minister in Kurdistan. And the very first place that the current prime minister visited, Mr. Barzani, was Baghdad. He made very bold, very strong statements saying that Baghdad is a strategic option for us, and we see it as our strategic depth. And but this, we hear the same thing from Baghdad, but this has to be translated into practical steps that we have not seen yet. we are still trying the same old method. I think today the time is ripe for a new approach, for a new style of conducting negotiations. And the atmosphere is much better than before. I think the starting point for all of us would be a common vision of the day when we sit down and say that all four hanging issues, outstanding issues between Erbil and Baghdad are solved. The day has come. With that, I would like to end by a question for His Excellency, Mr. Hawrami. When you sit in Erbil or in Baghdad, I mean, is there a common vision of what that day looks like? Or is there a vision for that day? I mean, in your view, what will happen? What will that day look like when we say all four issues are solved? And does Baghdad share the same vision as you? Thank you.
Thank you, Kakiwa, and we'll hold that question for a couple minutes so that we can hear from Maria and Ahmed. We'll turn to Maria now. You've written quite a lot on the social implications of past salary cuts on Kurdish society. For this current situation, this current crisis, what ripple effects do you see across Kurdish society? Might there be demonstrations and might there be sort of an alignment with a protest movement in Kurdistan and Baghdad?
Thank you, Mac, for inviting me today, and I'm very honored to share the panel with Kakhemin and other colleagues. Yes, and I think that it's very important actually to build on what the previous speakers have said in regards of how much KRI could actually benefit for a long-term strategy, and both vis-a-vis of Baghdad and also in front of the governance of its own society. So I would like to focus exactly on these points, on these 2 points. We said that there is a need for a sustainable approach, a sustainable approach in the negotiation also with Baghdad. And I think we have to focus a lot also on the instruments, how to put in place that sustainable approach. I think that there has been a genuine effort from the Kurdish leadership since 2017 to really re-engage with Baghdad. But at the same time, we have seen that this has really taken the form of a more short-term deals with politicians in Baghdad. And every time that the crisis hit Baghdad, also Kurdistan was affected. We have seen that with the protest movement. As soon as the protest started, then some people in Baghdad started to put in question the autonomy of the semi-autonomy of the Kurdistan region. We have seen that with the US-Iran confrontation, where many people in Baghdad blame Kurdish parliamentarians for not attending the sessions on US and foreign troop expulsion, and also there has been a lot of problems of coordination between Iraqi Kurdish security forces and Iraqi security forces on the disputed territories. And also we have seen that with the last financial crisis which have hit Baghdad, but also the first victim of it have been actually Kurdistan. So it's very important, I think, to shift from this short-termism to a more long-term approach, which I think, if I may, could start with a reinvestment into a presence in Baghdad, which is not only a presence at the ministerial level. We have seen that now with the negotiation on the new government, there has been a lot of talks about who is going to be leading certain ministries. It's very important to have the Kurdish ministers in Baghdad, but it's equally important, and I will say even more important, to invest in middle and senior ranks within those ministries. So, for instance, also in order to have sustainable agreements on these outstanding issues, such as disputed territories, such as oil and budget sharing, it's important to have Kurdish officials present that are capable, that are present at the DG's levels in Baghdad. We have seen that in the aftermath of the invasions, there has been a sort of investment into this, but now many of those officials are actually either retiring or are not anymore there because they left due to the political division between Erbil and Baghdad. So there is really a need for investing on capable middle rank officials, which will be present in the Baghdad ministries. One example is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has been Kurdish-led for more than 10 years, and yet at the middle ranks level, you don't have so many Kurdish officials. So this just an advice or an idea that maybe some KRI officials could think as a way forward, to think about how a new approach towards Baghdad could move forward, really reinvesting into the middle ranks and negotiating now middle ranks position for Kurdish officials in Baghdad. In the second point that I would like to address is exactly what you asked me about, the social implications of the budget crisis. I think that even here, there is a point to be made on how KRI will benefit in shifting from a short-term approach to a long-term approach. The short-term approach that we have seen until now, it's a leadership which strongly and increasingly relies on public sector salaries and also on security control of the society in some cases, in order to maintain the stability of Kurdistan, in order to prevent that there will be in some cases uprisings happening. However, this has also a major backlash, I will say, because this creates a situation where the KRI leadership is still very dependent on the oil revenues and also on the budget flows that comes to Baghdad in order to maintain that stability. So it still puts the KRI leadership in a very fragile position. It is true that the delays in payments, for the time being, I expect that they will not actually create a major uprising across Kurdistan, simply because even the lower incomers, those ones who have a very low revenues, they are still prioritizing survival, even if revenues, even if salaries comes with delays, they would actually prefer to actually hang on those salaries rather than challenging the system. Also because there has been a major disappointment after the 2011 protest, and also because I will say the Kurdish opposition parties have really failed in major cases to really bring those protesters' demands into the fore of the parliament in the past. However, we see still a very concerning phenomenon, which is the fact that these delays in the payment of salary, which now are going to happen, will more and more impoverish the Kurdish middle class. So this is a very concerning factor, because people who earn $500, $700 per month have been hit basically by two financial crises, the 2014 and this financial crisis. They haven't been able to actually save money over the past 4 years, because they have been always trying to live on the edge in order to survive. And I think that this impoverished middle class will really be those ones who actually will mobilize. They will mobilize in protest at the very local level, not across Kurdistan. And I expect there will be similar events as those ones that we have seen already in the Hook, where teachers actually mobilize in protest, but really are not necessarily connected with other teachers in Suleimani. So you have a situation where really there is a local mobilization, which oftentimes I expect will be also manipulated by local political parties to blame other political parties in other regions of the responsibilities of not paying salary. So we will have an outcome really that is that one, that even if you don't have a major appraising, you still have a major political division inside KRI, which will once again put KRI leadership into a very fragile position, having to face its own internal division on the one hand, and still having to wait for Baghdad to pay the salaries in order to keep things in control. So again, it's very important, I think, from now on for KRI leadership, especially that now we see new generation of leaders really coming up, is that one of thinking how we can neutralize.
We might have lost Maria for a second.
That's European internet for you.
Yeah, there you go.
We're more advanced here in third world.
We'll give her 10 more seconds, and then we'll switch over to Ahmed. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and.
Yeah.
Okay, you're back, Maria.
Finished anyway.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, great. Thanks, Maria. And finally, we'll turn to Ahmed. Ahmed, just looking at the more sort of technical economic and monetary side, you've argued in previous articles that you've written that essentially all previous budgetary and revenue agreements between the KRG and Baghdad were unsustainable and essentially only existed in theory and were never implemented. Is there any chance that this dynamic might break under the current situation, or are we going to see more of the same?
Okay, well, thank you, Mac, and it's a great pleasure to be on this panel of people who I follow and admire, so it's great to be with you all, guys. Okay, the question is, will it break? This time, absolutely, it's about to break because these are not going to work anymore. Although like in a sense, I'm going to focus on the budget agreement and the points that I have on the budget agreement, what we got to keep in mind is all this talk cannot be taken out of context from a history of conflict and a history of a conflicting view of what the state is between the vision of a strong central government or a strong regional government, not only the KRG, but the potentially other ones. That has taken pretty much a center stage when it comes to the exploration and the production and sale of hydrocarbons. That lies at the heart of it. So we're not going to go over the details of the constitution, but I think the issues lie there in substantially different interpretations and different visions of how to go from there. The thing is, right now, with the crisis brought on for oil prices by COVID-19, the way I look at it is that for as far as Iraq is concerned, and that's on the federal level as well as on the KRG levels, this kind of crisis would have happened no matter what. We were going to be in a crisis like this, irrespectively, because both of us, both the federal government as well as the regional government, has a huge structural imbalance in their budget. And that's basically relying on the continuous feeding the public sector payroll at the expense of everything else. So in a sense, and also that's one, two, the current crisis is not going to go away. In the sense that not like prior crises which we were hit by a crisis 2014, 2017, that eventually we had to get out of them and we got high oil prices, which bailed out both parties. The way post-COVID world economy looks, at least to me, is that yes, we are going to recover from the current low oil prices. Yes, oil prices would recover substantially from current levels, but they're not going to be to levels whereby, just like the past, allow us to pepper over all these divisions and go over them. So to go to the heart of why this time it's broken and why it needs totally fresh thinking, in a way it goes back to the current 2019 budget. And if I may, I want to share my screen with you and just show one set of figures. I know it's economics and probably bore people, but I think it's fairly important to highlight numbers because that's really where you can see where the problem are. But really the whole problem is in the Iraqi way of dealing with all issues. Ever since the constitution was written, clarity was sacrificed for consensus. And that's why we end up by paying for it. So every agreement, every discussion, we have a broad agreement, but we have no agreement on details. And as everybody knows, the devil in the detail. Plus, there are no mechanisms for conflict resolution. So that's what happens. If something goes wrong, each party goes to its own capital, and we end up by having this ever series of recrimination. I will share my screen, but I won't be too long. So let me see if I can do my sharing screen properly. And let's see, is this working? Yes, I think it is. Okay, so here's my first screen. And this is what I want to share with you right now. And this is why I think the current agreement is completely unworkable. If you look at the 2019 figures, and here I'm using the data that was given by the Deloitte audit of the KRG's oil export for 2018, 2019, and 2017, although it's 2019 figures, as well as the data provided by the KRG in their recent letter to the central government in terms of figures. There are some estimates on my part, but the data is all there. The first thing is that if we listen to the budget and we go on what does the budget say, it says crucially two things. That one, the KRG would ship 250,000 barrels through SOMO, and it should give the proceeds of its independent sales of the rest. For 2019, the KRG pretty much exported something like 439,000 barrels a day. Okay, if that was to happen, by the way, if from day one in 2019, both parties agreed to it, then this is what the KRG would get. It would get $8.2 billion from Baghdad, which covers almost everything. Two, it has independent oil, non-oil revenues of about, I'm estimating, by the way, based on prior data and so forth, something like just under $2 billion. Now, here is when you get the first crisis. None of the agreements discuss this, by the way. None of the agreements ever mention what are they going to do about non-oil revenues. The problem with that is that this disagreement between both parties affects the economy in general. Why? Because until they had a unified in terms on customs, we had a case in Iraq whereby a disjointed market, in a way, a market that was not working properly, different charges on each side, which basically creates a market that doesn't work. But crucially as well, when it comes to tax collection, what many people don't realize is, especially when it comes to many companies that operates across Iraq, and that's particularly evident in banks. So for example, banks that have operations in the KRG, they pay tax twice. They pay KRG on their KRG operations, and they pay tax on the whole operation to Baghdad. And when they talk to other parties, everybody says, no, it's not my business. That can't continue because in a way it creating. But the real issue here comes in, and that comes into basic this point here, is oil operating expenses. And basically I'm taking from the Deloitte figures, the expenses which basically the IOCs pay, as well as the charges for transportation. This is really where it becomes problematic for the KRG in this sense. You cannot say, you give me oil, you give me revenues, but I've got nothing to do with the agreements that you've signed with all the oil companies. So in a sense, all the prior agreement assumed that the KRG would take care of the IOC's share. That doesn't make sense in a way unless we end up by accepting those things. So that's number one. And if you look at that and you look at the charges for a thing, there's no way the KRG could actually in any way comply with that agreement, because its costs would have been substantially higher than what it would get. And mostly it's because of this item here, what it pays for the IOCs, as well as transportation of oil and so forth. So unless an agreement addresses the issue on the constitution, on the marketability, on the exploration of oil, whether existing or new fields, it's not going to work. That's one. On the other hand, if you look at in terms of what the central government has, the central government, if it sells the oil, it will get this much and pay that much. It'll get a slight positive, but that doesn't take care of everything else. The other issue that you have a problem with in terms of how we go forward from here is the fact that these numbers here assume that Baghdad gets to sell 250,000 oil, gets the revenue from the other extra oil. Now, the other extra oil, the same channels that the KRG sells from, the federal government has taken Turkey to court over this agreement of the Iraq-Turkey pipeline agreement. So in a way, you're expecting to get paid revenues on an export route that you don't believe in. Now, going forward from here, I've just put in some numbers of what I think the numbers will look like this year, and basically taking a 25% haircut to this figure. And by the way, I think honestly, ultimately the figure will be much higher than 25%. I cannot see us a longer term surviving with anything cut more than a 40% cut to our operating expenses, as opposed to, but let's assume 25%, still the numbers don't work. And even if you take it one step further, one of the things that can't work is that last year in the Deloitte figures, what the figures have showed is that the KRG has made additional what's called forward oil sales of about $1.6 billion. And that these outstanding forward oil sales are about something like $3.4 billion. The issue with that basically means, given where oil prices are right now, that $4 billion is pretty much exactly what the region would get from exporting all of its oil. So before you get into any agreement between, let's say, the politicians, I think what needs to be done is that technical people or technocrats sit down and go over the details, because everything that's happened over the last few years has consequences and you cannot escape them. So currently, for example, today, there was news in Bloomberg that Glencore, which is one of the oil traders that has been one of the ones that lent, has an issue with $500 million worth of its debt and is trying to restructure them, in the sense that they're claiming, I think so far the news are not early, but there's a default on them. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be solved beyond repeating the mantra, 250,000 oil barrels a day, plus this, plus that. We need to go into look at the details of all of that. So that's sort of, in a way, where I think we should go. We should, like, going forward from here, what we need to do is we need to sit down, first of all, and agree and understand on a common definition of what the Constitution says about oil sales. That has to be resolved, because without that, and without honoring all the agreements, you can't go forward. Once you do that, you sit down and you begin to compare notes, share data, and start a fresh dialogue. And as well as got to be in the sense that anything that's agreed by both parties has got to take into account that we need to restructure the budget for both sides. There's no need to share anymore. So we need to restructure that part of the relationship. So how to go about that? Because how would with other party, the federal government as well as how would they tell their people what to deal with when it comes to severe cuts in a way? So I end that presentation. I can answer many questions down the line if anybody has not fell asleep on my economic side. But I think I have the question, which I have basically to His Excellency, and that goes basically over the tone right now. What I'm seeing is, at least currently, from what we hear, is that actually it feels like a very fresh start, at least between both sides, in terms of the goodwill, in terms of sharing of data and so forth. The question that always come into, by the way, is whatever agreement is going to come up with is going to come with an agreement with substantially less money for the region, as well as pro rata as less money for Iraq. Has that discussion started? And that's one. And two, any discussion, does it address the one thing that we have to leave behind us, and that is the definition in the Constitution of who has the right to market oil, and where is the region and where is that? So without that, I cannot see us actually ever surviving without another issue coming back. So let me stop there and I'll leave it for questions.
Thank you, Ahmed. Now we're going to have kind of a section where the panelists can pose questions to each other. Why don't we start with Kakiwa, since you already kind of posed the first question. Would you mind restating your question?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent presentations. Wow, very eye-opening. My question was from Mr. Hawrami, who is His Excellency Deputy Speaker, was that, is there a common vision between the two for the day that we will, when we say all the issues are settled between Erbil and Baghdad? When will that, is there a day in mind when no longer we have to send delegations to Baghdad and Baghdad delegations come here and we say, given all the issues that have been discussed, is there a vision of such day in Kurdistan? And is there one in Baghdad, do you think? And is there agreement between the two?
Okay, should I start answering?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Kagiwa, and thank you for Kag Ahmed also for the great explanation, and for Maria. To be very honest with you, from Kurdistan region, yes, there is a common vision, but in Baghdad, that I cannot speak on behalf of Baghdad. But from our perspective, I do believe we have to do a reassessment from this threat perspective, both from Baghdad to Erbil and from Erbil to Baghdad. That's number one. And also to redefine the social contract or the agreement that we have based on the constitution between Baghdad and Erbil. From our side, it's very important that, as Mr. Ahmed mentioned, that Baghdad adheres to the concept and to the core of federalism and the power sharing with Kurdistan region as a federal region within Iraq. The question is now, for the hydrocarbon in Baghdad, this strong centralized mentality without implementing the core of federalism for the power sharing with Kurdistan region, not having the hydrocarbon law for the federal state in Iraq. That has been one of the impediments, that common vision that we have. So, and the other question is that, will Baghdad continue based on that ethnic or sectarian majority rule-based working of the government in Baghdad, and without having that true partnership, power sharing with Kurdistan region and with the other components? So, and also do things to be more interdependence between Kurdistan region and Baghdad over gas, over natural resources, over the other issues that we have. So from our perspective is that, and it's very important that Baghdad adheres to the core of federalism and adheres to the constitution, and also to pass those laws that has been stipulated in the constitution, that we need to redefine it, most importantly on the oil and hydrocarbon, and also for Kurdistan region also to find itself its fair shares within the institution. As Maria Fantapa correctly mentioned, that it's true that we have a minister or a president in Iraq, but if you go to the details of the general directors on the technocratic situations in the ministries in Baghdad, Kurdistan region doesn't have more than 2 to 3% of the representation that is needed to have within the ministries, as important for the day-to-day jobs that we have. And also it's very important that, for example, for the Iraqi government, will they adhere to their obligation, the constitutional obligation toward the Kurdistani people, toward the Peshmerga forces, implementing Article 140 and the future of this disputed territory? So these are so many issues. If we don't see that kinds of the negotiation in Baghdad and having those kinds of the political stability in Baghdad and statements in order to adhere to that common vision, and really, as I mentioned, to redefine threat perspective, to believe that and to act that Kurdistan region is not a strong federal regional government, is not a threat to Baghdad. It's a complement to Baghdad, and of a strong federal government in Baghdad also implement the constitution will be helpful for us. And also, as I mentioned, to redefine that social contract within the constitution is to implement the constitution that we have. But the biggest and the question that we have is going to assess which part of the constitution have been implemented and which have not been implemented. What has led to the referendum was the lack of implementation of 54 articles of the Iraqi constitution. That has been one of the very important issues to be addressed. But with this continuous particular political situation in Baghdad, in the near future, I myself, it's my personal point of view, I don't see that kinds of the common vision.
Thank you, Kakeman. Let's turn to Ahmed again. Ahmed, do you want to kind of restate your question?
Well, yeah, basically that. I think he partly answered my question, because I was saying basically that we need to do two things. We need to address the issue on the constitution. I mean, has discussions started on that? Yeah. Certainly, Baghdad and Erbil seem to be talking a very different tone than in the past. I mean, the language, the tone, the thing, everything seems far more promising this stage, which is quite positive. But have we started that dialogue? That's one. Two, within that dialogue, have we discussed the restructuring of the budget of both sides? Because whatever there is in terms of oil revenues either side, it's not going to be enough. And thirdly, I would say, what about, I mean, like the issue always keeps on popping up in discussion. Sorry, I'm going to end really, really quick, is the question on debt. And we always hear demand, we want this debt to be paid, etc., and so forth, but has there actually a discussion started on the technical issues of the debt? Like, you know, how it started, the terms of the details, because sound bites are great, they make everybody feel good, but they don't answer the details. I mean, for me as a researcher, I barely get a chance to, you know, from reading sort of gazillion articles and so forth, just to get a glimpse of some of the issues. So in a sense, has these discussions started? Because if they start, then certainly we can be on the road to resolution.
Okay,
yes. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, for that great questions. Yes, definitely with Prime Minister Kazemi, even previously with Prime Minister at that time, Adel Abdul Mahdi, this has been discussed, and there has been a very good ground between both sides in order to discuss based on the constitution. Absolutely, and as I said, from Kurdistan region, the strategic path is that continue dialogue with Baghdad based on the constitution that we have, But as I said, we are waiting for the end of the holidays of the feast for the delegation to go back and to start in the details. But one of the issues that we have now, we have this called the Qanun Idara al-Maliyya, the financial management law. And the talks are within this Qanun Idara al-Maliyya because we don't have the budget for 2020. So that's why negotiations will be based on the coming months until we have the 2020, then to prepare for 2021. And absolutely, for the issues that even as a goodwill gestures, for the confidence building, for the mutual trust that is needed in order to pave the way for that long-term agreement with Baghdad, is that the Kurdistan region has been for the oil revenues to be shared with Baghdad, but in turn, Baghdad's constitutional obligations in terms of the financial obligation toward Kurdistan, because it's not only the oil revenues, but the cost recovery for the oil companies and the debts that we have, because Iraq from February 2014 up to 2019, they had cut the budget from Kurdistan. And absolutely, we have been saying we are ready just to assess how much we got as a loan and how much we spent, because the actual expenditure of Kurdistan regions, the data is that also in that public letter to the Iraqi Council of Ministers, it had been mentioned on the years base and the monthly base, what we have been spending in Kurdistan region and what Iraq has been, with the debts that we have. So if Iraq is ready to be, to be in the loop for all of that with a transparent, based on the auditing from the financial auditing authorities that we have in Baghdad and Kurdistan region, we are ready for, as I said, from Kurdistan region, we have no reservations for talks on any of the talks that on the subjects that we have, but in return also we must see practical steps from Baghdad. So the goodwill gesture that from Prime Minister Kazemi by announcing that they are sending this 400 billion, it's as I correctly Kagiwa mentioned, our issue with Baghdad is not only the salary issue. The KRG is not only responsible for the salaries of people. There are so many other constitutional issues between Kurdistan and Baghdad. It should not be narrowed to whether Baghdad is sending a few billion Iraqi dinars or not. Because as I said, the resurgence of ISIS is a common threat. The fall of the oil price is a common threat for Kurdistan region. Iraq's positions in relations with the United States and Iran, willy-nilly, the foreign policy of Iraq, in either direction, it's going to not only to affect Baghdad, it's going to affect Erbil as well. So that's why there are so many other issues between Baghdad and Erbil that we need to have a grand bargaining, and in order for the Baghdad stability and for the Kurdistan stability.
Thank you. Maria?
Yes, two questions. The first one related to this presence of the DGs. If we agree that sustainable agreement requires also sustainable presence in Baghdad, it's not only about a delegation going one day to Erbil, from Erbil to Baghdad. So is this point of capable professional Kurdish officials entering in the ministries in Baghdad in the agenda, in the negotiation, or do you think that this could be possibly included? If not, and the second question, it's about the social discontent. I mean, of course, there is widespread discontent towards the KRI leadership. Do you and also this problem of the impoverishment of the middle class? Do you have, or are you thinking of a strategy on how actually to preserve the middle class, allow the middle class still to be able to really be surviving and not becoming just an impoverished middle class, part of the lower incomers? Is there a strategy aimed at this that you are thinking of? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. As part of the negotiation, it has been on the Kurdistan region's fair shares in the ministries in Baghdad, and not only for the KDP and PUK to take ministerial positions, but also we have the other parties within the Iraqi Council of Representatives, like for Quran, like the Islamic Union of Kurdistan, like the Islamic Group of Kurdistan, like the New Generation. It's true that some of them in Kurdistan region, they are acting as opposition, but in Baghdad for this national government, most of their leadership, they share the same vision that we have. So absolutely, below the level of the ministers, for the deputy ministers, for the general directors, we have been asking, we have been talking about the fair share for Kurdistan region. For example, The Deputy Minister of Finance has been from Kurdistan region, but since has been asking for retirement, now he has been replaced with someone else. Look at all the security services. What are the fair shares of Kurdistan region professionally in terms of the certain positions within the security services in Iraq, and the Ministry of Interiors, at the intelligence service, at the counterterrorism, at the National Security Council, all of the levels that we have. So yes, absolutely, it's very important for Kurdistan region, and it has been one of the topics, and we will continue discussing fair share of Kurdistan regions with to have this kinds of the representations of the ministry, the ministers level. Concerning the social discontent in Kurdistan region, absolutely, we are aware of that because of the lack of continuation of distributing the salaries on time, because of the cut and the history that we have, and because of the low level. But just to verify this one, the 9th cabinets and the parliament together, all together, reform has been the slogan and the action for all of us, for all the blocs, even with those who are in the opposition. So absolutely reforming. We can't continue on the same path that Kurdistan region has been on since 1992. We have made a lot of mistakes in terms of the governance, administrations, fighting corruption, and we have to address these ones. So in order to be very transparent with that. So the reform bill that was passed in the Kurdistan region, it is not all the reform process that is needed in Kurdistan. It has been only reforms in terms of the salaries and the allowances, and we have to readdress them. Another thing that we have been encouraging the KRG, and we have been following through the parliament standing committees, also to strengthen the private sector in Kurdistan. In order to strengthen the private sector in Kurdistan, we have to amend the investment law in Kurdistan in order to encourage the private sector. And also and now, just this is also maybe a scoop for you, the KRG at the Council of Ministers, they have finalized the amending the investment law, and we are waiting for the next meeting of the Council of Ministers in order to be ratified and to send it to Parliament in order to vote it for in Parliament. Another thing also is to diversify the source of revenues in Kurdistan by monitoring the tax collections in Kurdistan, by privatization of, for example, electricity distributions and collections of the money for those who are using electricity in Kurdistan, and encouraging companies in Kurdistan for the levels of the working in the in the fields that is adding to the small businesses in Kurdistan, agriculture, industrial projects in Kurdistan. So through that, and also by cutting down and encouraging people from the public sector to turn to the private sector. And part of the reform law that was passed in Kurdistan is to establish this retirement fund at the Ministry of Finance, for the same also for the private sector and the public sector, because previously we didn't have that one. But as you know, we have been in Kurdistan region, we have been the victims of systematic policies of the previous regimes to change the Kurdistani society from producing society into a consumer society. And since 1992, due to the civil war, to sanctions that we have, lack of enough resources, we couldn't change that trend from a producing society, a rural-based economy, and small businesses economy, in order that it's not easy for us to, within a certain period of time, to change the behaviors of our people from consumers again to producers. But definitely through vocational training, through diversifying the source of the economy, it is on the course of the parliament and the KRG. But to say that this is going to be fruitful and within the next 1 or 2 years, it's too early to say that.
Thank you to our panelists. We're now going to turn to the questions from the participants. A number of participants have asked about the tensions between the KDP and the PUK. And there's no secret that the tensions between the two parties has escalated, and there are ongoing negotiations between the two sides. The question, which is directed to Kak Hemen and to Kak Kiwa, but I think anyone can answer it, is how is this tension between KDP and PUK likely to play out in the ongoing negotiations? Is it going to play the role of a spoiler, or will there be a genuine united front?
So Kagiwa, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, well, situation is really bad between the two parties. We feel it in the air and at every level. I think, unfortunately, in Parliament, you had your episode of stripping somebody from immunity, and we saw what happened. It reminded us a lot of the back in 2000, when was it? About the presidency law, the 23rd of June's meeting. When it comes to COVID-19 measures, even over the smallest issues, the two parties, you feel that they are waiting for anything to score a point against the other. And we keep going back to history, recent and more less recent history of the two things that the two parties did against each other. And it is reflecting big time in Baghdad, in the presence in Baghdad. We saw how Mr. Abdurrahman Mustafa, a very decent man, was told by the two parties that he will be their candidate for justice. And then big part of what happened was the disagreement between the two parties, or the lack of agreement, and the chaos between the blocs gave this man, a very decent man, I would vote for him with my eyes closed. He had 2 votes in parliament, in the Baghdad parliament, to become in the ministry, in Kadhimi's ministry. So the situation, more recently we've been hearing from Suleimaniya, calls for decentralization and moving away from Baghdad. It is not playing a good role in the talks at every level. You know, even with COVID-19, with talking to Baghdad, you know, in fighting ISIS. Yesterday there were some leaks that many ISIS prisoners were handed over to Baghdad by Soleimani administration. We talk about KRG, we talk about a united parliament, we talk about a united government, but unfortunately in practice we have 2 KRGs, we still have the 2 zones. The situation of 2 administrations still lingers in Kurdistan, and whenever the opportunity arises, we see how it comes up very easily. It's very easy to revert back to the 2 administrations and go to Baghdad, or let's say have two different views on very issues, rather than having a common view. I think the absence of Mam Jalal plays a big role in both in Baghdad and in Kurdistan, in playing the uniting factor, even either within his party and in Kurdistan.
Hakiman, I think it's important to hear from you on this issue as well, on the question of the relation.
Can I add to that question on the KDP UK? It's important. I would like to be very frank and very open on these issues. Absolutely, there are some differences between KDP and PUK. But both leadership recognize that one very well, that none of us, neither KDP or PUK can get it alone, and just without each other, Kurdistan will be more prosperous and stability. Yes, absolutely, there are different political views, but if you know that in supporting Mustafa Kazmi, we shared the same vision and supported him strongly. And now even with the negotiation of the KRG's delegation that once led by Khubat, for example, and he did a very fantastic job in talks with Baghdad. In Parliament, when we had that session for the immunity, then we just followed the bylaw and the law of Kurdistan Parliament, but unfortunately it has been politicized for some of the perspective and the purposes. Now I would like to reassure you and all the attendees and those who are participating that none of this is going to make KDP and PUK cannot talk to each other and not to solve, because we have seen worse than what we are right now. And I can assure you that after the Eid holidays, there will be a very important both Politburo's meeting will be followed by a senior meeting between the co-chairs of UK and our leadership as well. And we both know that with this differences here and then, PDP doesn't have any alternative for UK, and PUK doesn't have any alternative for PDP, and we have to live together and to solve these issues.
Thank you. We have a question that's directed to Kakiwa and to Maria regarding this whole question of there being a long-term vision or not. But the specific angle of this question is, how do the major Shia political parties in Baghdad look towards the Kurds in relation to a kind of short-term, long-term strategy? Does a party like Seyrun have a kind of trajectory they're looking at, or is it just kind of ad hoc? If you could talk about maybe some of the distinctions between the parties in Baghdad and how they're approaching the Kurds at this moment.
Me or Maria?
Hiwa, go ahead.
Baghdad is quite a diverse setup politically. On every issue, we saw even within on internal Shia issues, we should not fool ourselves then to believing that Baghdad is pluralistic and it's being ruled by a mixture of Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites. This is not the reality. The reality is Baghdad is run by Shiite political blocs. Whoever they want, they can pass in parliament, and whoever they don't want, they can take out. They can vote out, and they are the ones who call the shots in parliament. And Kurds and Sunnis effectively follow. They have to have an agreement with the other political blocs. What happened, this is, I think, believe over the years, one of the shortcomings of the Kurdish delegations that went to Baghdad, or the Kurdish negotiator, or the Kurdish officials in Baghdad, is that they stayed within the administrative structures of the Iraqi state. They were in ministries, ministers, and possibly deputy minister. They were not present within they did not have that interaction with the politicians of Baghdad. Our MPs in Baghdad, with all due respect, they had many shortcomings again. And now with the current batch of MPs across the board, I mean, language is, for example, one of the key issues for them. Other officials as well, and one of the reasons for the non-presence of Kurds, as Maria was saying, is simply language. I mean, I think Kak Hemen and I are the last Arabic-speaking generation of Kurds. Everyone who's younger than us cannot speak Arabic. So how do you send these guys to Baghdad, even when it comes to MPs and others? As a result, this has affected the views of the various political blocs. You would see somebody who's in parliament from any bloc, any Shia bloc, takes the Kurdish, the Erbil-Baghdad issue as an issue to put pressure on the government, or to score a point against the other political blocs, the other Shia political blocs, in order to score political points. But at the same time, we have, you can see that these, they don't know much about the details. The media has not played a good role in a very constructive role in that. For a few days ago, for example, they would bring somebody like Judge Wael Abdul Latif, and he says all the problems of Iraq from 1920 until now is because of the Kurds, and nobody responds to him. There wasn't anyone else with him in the studio. Even the presenter was kind of agreeing with him. We saw that video went viral in Kurdistan. That kind of atmosphere is still there. Part of it, I think the Kurds are to blame for this. They do not have a strong PR or a machine in Baghdad that explains to the public. Their presence in the Arab media isn't as it should be. The Kurds have many Arabists. I think the most non-Arab nation in the neighborhood that has the largest number of Arabists. We have many Arabic-speaking people from the generation that are older than us, but none of them were in Baghdad. Very few of them were in Baghdad. They're sitting in Kurdistan, and Baghdad was left for number of MPs and for the number one officials in Baghdad or in the ministries. As a result, most of the political blocs, they look at Kurdistan as a point where they can score political points at each other. I'll give you one example of that. I was in Baghdad in the run-up to the referendum. And after the referendum, and the referendum came shortly after declaring victory over ISIS. The euphoria that was in the media and in the social media that was spreading by the taking of Kirkuk by the Iraqi army and the Hashd al-Shabi was 10 times more than the euphoria than being happy over winning over ISIS. And in this, I don't think it's just the fault of the other side. The Kurds have something to answer for as well.
Maria?
Yeah, well, I think that there is really part of the problem. It's really this sort of mismatch between the vision that Kurdish politicians have of Baghdad and the vision that Baghdad politicians have of Kurdistan. From strictly an analytical point of view, because I'm not a Kurd, I'm not an Iraqi, I would say that the approach that the leadership in Kurdistan has shaped towards Baghdad is still based on the experience of the previous regime until now. Even among the younger politicians, there is still this idea that there should be reparations, which is, of course, right in its own terms. However, for the injustices that have been that the Kurds have been suffering during the past regimes. However, then when we go to Baghdad, the people who are there have nothing to do, or have little to do with the previous regime, and they have actually shaped their own approach towards Kurdistan more on the immediate aftermath of the invasions when they actually came to power. So their approach to Kurdistan, it's more of that experience. So a Kurdistan that wants federalism, a Kurdistan who wants independence, and a Kurdistan that organized in 2017 a referendum. So there is always this approach where the Kurds are there to actually steal from Baghdad and then flee afterwards. So there is this gap, I think, between the two capitals that remains really unresolved. That's for sure one of the problem, and I think that a way to resolve this gap, as Kakiwa was saying, is really to invest in a like capable personnel who is Arabic speaking from Kurdistan, who is sent to work and to stay in Baghdad. Because these are the people who are going to understand the Shia politics, the Sunni politics, the Baghdad politics, the day-to-day politics, the way that world works. If you just go one day and send a delegation, if you just have one minister there, this will not be enough to understand and to enter into this day-to-day Baghdad politics. Instead, you really need this continuous presence of officials of different ranks, not necessarily very top ranks, ministerial ranks, and also officials who are not necessarily party members, Kurdish parties members, but officials who are capable, who are professionals, who can really help Kurdistan to strategize. I think that's part of the solution for turning the page of the past and solving this mismatch between the two perceptions. This will be the bridge. These people, this class of people will be the bridge. But again, language, as Kakiwa was saying, it's a big problem. But I'm sure there is something that can be done on this.
Thanks, Maria. We have a couple of questions on decentralization and the degree to which there might be, especially in the midst of this current budget crisis, a move on the part of Soleimani province to demand more sort of power for itself, budgetary and otherwise. Kakemen, what are your thoughts on this issue and whether or not this question of decentralization within the KRG will remain a flashpoint?
Unfortunately, the process and the talks about the decentralization, again, it has been politicized recently. And if you go back also unfortunately, some voices in Soleimani after October 16th and in early 2018. They have been talking, when there was some tension, they have been talking about decentralization. And this is also, it's not out of the context of the recent, unfortunately, differences and some tensions that there were between KDP and PUK. Away from the tension and within the context, decentralization, the most important thing is the governance and how to find the good services and for the people of Kurdistan wherever they are. So it has been, in Kurdistan Parliament, we have passed a law in 2009 for decentralization, and we are with the full implementation of this law. And any talks, any suggestions from any side, from the Provincial Council, from the governance, it's not only Soleimani, it's also Duhok, it's Erbil, and it's Halabja. If there is a decentralization, it must be for the 4 provinces that we have. So absolutely, we are supporting decentralization in a way that can serve the people of Kurdistan in the districts, sub-districts, the villages, and the provinces that we have within the territorial integrity of the Kurdistan region as a constitutional entity. So that's why it has been also, if I take, if I put my KDP hat, when we had the negotiation with PUK, with Goran, prior to the formation of the 9th cabinet, there is a political agreement between KDP and PUK and KDP and Goran, and the issue of decentralization, it has been fixed, and now it is part of the political agreement. And we in the parliament, when we voted for the manifesto of the cabinet's 9th cabinet, when Masroor Barzani, prime minister, read it out in the parliament, we voted, and it is in one of the one of the most important articles within this government program that it needs to be implemented. So we are welcoming any idea to implement decentralization within Kurdistan region, and in order to make sure that the services and the enough budget and enough administration authorities will be given for the governors, for the mayors, so we don't have any sensitivity toward it.
So we have one final question, and it is directed towards Kakim and Ahmed on the oil sector. And specifically the status of forward oil sales. How much does the KRG owe, and under what authority could they make the deal? And just in general, to comment on the status of that issue. We'll start with Kakiman.
It's true that I am Hawrami, but I am not Ashti Hawrami. So don't mix me with him to know all the details about all the debts and everything on oil. Just to give you the outline, the 9th cabinet, when they took over a prime minister in parliament, he mentioned that we have $24 billion debt in Kurdistan. 9 billion of it is for the salaries of the people when Baghdad cut the budget. And the others is when we had to get loan and debts from the oil companies, from the lenders, in order to fill in and to pay for the people of Kurdistan. So for November, December, January, and February, we have not been capable and postponed the payment for the international oil companies, but for March it has been fully met, and for April is going to be fully met. But definitely this is that's why we have the debt management office started, and the council of ministers in Kurdistan, and we in parliament, we will follow very carefully in order to be ready to know exactly how much we have the debts and how to pay it back.
Ahmed.
Okay, it's my turn right now to end it, yeah? So when it comes to oil sales, there's 2 things. One is what the speaker addressed, which is basically the dues to oil companies for their rights for producing oil by what's called cost of production and profit. The thing which is fairly going to make life very complicated, I think, for the future agreement is what's called forward oil sales, which basically you sell a value of your oil in the future. So basically, this is not to the oil companies, but this is to the oil traders who actually sell the oil outside the country. That figure, as I said, is about 4.6. $4.6 billion, 4.2 or something. Sorry, forgive me, $3.4 billion, as was reported by the Deloitte report. That says, by the way, it's almost like $3.4 billion of oil belongs to somebody else. At current oil prices, if the region produces and exports, let's say 430,000 barrels at current prices, that's barely enough to pay that debt in a way. So that will make the whole revenue sharing that much more complicated. Now, obviously, what is needed is like a thorough agreement between both parties in terms of what are the liabilities, what are the details, how do we negotiate these. It's not a question of, yes, I give you my oil, but there are obligations both to the oil companies in terms of their rights for oil extraction and the cost of production, as well as the guys who sold the oil. That are what I think until recently seems to me was lacking in a way, because all we hear is both sides shout about 250,000 barrels as if that's a mantra. I mean, you know, it's an easier said thing than thought about, but it definitely will make life complicated. And I think it will probably necessitate a kind of a holistic deal in which, at least financially, you not only address oil sales, but you address all the other issues that come with that. Because even when it comes to the whole argument about the disputed territories, for example, I done a lot of work in that a while ago, because if you cannot remove the economic argument when it comes to disputed territories, because if you add them to the region, you add substantially more than the region can afford to pay its people as it is right now in its current borders. So I think even that debate, we cannot divorce it from the cost of it, because whether the region, either Kirkuk or elsewhere, stays here or stays there, wherever it stays, its expenses have to be covered by whatever it is. Now, as it is right now, the region barely covers its expenses last year. So in a sense, I think any agreement between both parties have got to be at least agree the top part, i.e. Where we stand and the spirit of openness and so forth, but also on both parties have technocrats deal with the issues, because some of them are not capable to be dealt by politicians who don't know the ins and outs of every kind of complex thing and how it can complicate life even more than what it is, by the way. So with that happy thought, I will end.
Well, we're going to wrap up there. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you also to our participants, and we look forward to our next webinar after the Eid.